soir, quand tout ce soir, quand tout ce soir, quand tout se tait, par la soir, quand tout ce soir, quand tout ce soir, quand tout se tait, soir, quand tout se tait, par-delà ma fenêtre, ivoire, quand tout se tait, par-delà ma fenêtre, il est qu'on y parlait de rose et de je sais qu'on y parlait de rose et de comment. Je sais cette chanson-là rappelle mes amours. Je vois quand tout se tait par-delà ma fenêtre. Ivoire quand tout se tait par-delà ma fenêtre. Il est qu'on y parlait de rose et de qu'on y parlait de rosée à ma fenêtre, qui cette chanson-là rappelle mes amours. Je ne sais plus très bien comment je sais plus très bien comment je sais qu'on y parlait de rosée à ma fenêtre, qui qu'on y parlait.
Hello everyone and welcome to my third video update. So I'm actually recording this one from the UK and I've actually been here for quite a while, mostly because it ended up being kind of busy here and some things got pushed back, so I wasn't able to get this video out exactly when I wanted, but anyways, I'm doing it now. So in this video I'm going to be focusing on my 2 weeks that I spent in France. My time there was good overall, but I would say that it was probably my most challenging 2 weeks out of the whole journey. When I was in France, I started in a town called Quimper on the west coast, staying with some friends of friends, which was nice. I then moved on to stay for a couple days in Caen, which is in Normandy, which was interesting to see another part of France. And finally, I spent 5 days in Paris. So I did enjoy my visits to these three places, but I think the main thing that I was kind of fighting throughout the 2 weeks was this feeling of being burnt out, which I think is understandable looking back, because after like a whole month of spending time in the Netherlands, which I really did enjoy, but going out and seeing these monuments and museums and that sort of thing, carrying over to France, it was starting to feel a little repetitive to me, and especially in Paris, despite the fact that there were these amazing monuments around and stuff, I found that I just wasn't enjoying it as much, and I didn't feel like going out and stuff, and so that was kind of a learning experience in itself. I'm happy to say that after I moved on to the UK, I'm feeling quite refreshed now, and it hasn't really been an issue. But that's enough about the backstory. Let's go ahead and get into the 5 questions. Alright, so firstly, question number 1, is a gap year worth it? So I'd like to speak some from personal experience here, and I think 2 areas that I've continued to grow and improve in these past 2 weeks are definitely independence and confidence. I think especially during my second week in France, I was pretty much on my own, and I had to figure out my accommodation, transportation, entertainment and food all on my own. So it was kind of like, once again, another step up from what I had in the Netherlands. Also, like I was saying in the intro, I kind of had my own little personal crisis during this past 2 weeks where I was really feeling burnt out, like I didn't want to do anything. And although, of course, I was talking to people about that, it was something that I largely had to deal with on my own. I also just had to be confident enough to admit to myself that I just didn't really have the energy to go out and do these things some days, and that, I needed to recognize my limits and that sort of thing. So that was definitely a growing experience as well. Moving on now. The people that I've decided to interview for this video are named John and Kathleen. They're good friends of Jim and Nancy, which is where that connection came from, and they are the people I stayed with during my first week when I was in the town of Quimper on the west coast in France. Although John and Kathleen have only been living in France for a few years, before moving there they visited frequently, and they're both quite enthusiastic about French culture. So it turns out that both John and Kathleen did go to university right after high school, but both of them kind of thought that there could have been a better option.
I wish the concept of a gap year had been, around when I graduated from high school. Mm-hmm. I begged my parents to let me do something like that, even though we didn't call it a gap year. I begged my parents to let me just take a year after high school because I didn't have any clue really what I wanted to do, and they were absolutely firm. There's no way, you have these scholarship offers from St. Louis University, no, you got to go straight on to universities.
Oh, I think for me, to the part of your question, I look at a gap year, a year off from high school before you continue on exploring what to make of your life whatever you call it. It depends on the person. You could waste it. You could not waste it, you know?
Yeah.
For me, I automatically went on to college and it was a waste.
Another thing that's interesting is that in France, gap years are actually quite common, but they aren't always used for travel.
I believe that in France, it's a widely accepted idea. They call it une année sabbatique, so in a sabbatical year. As soon as I start to describe it, they say, "Oh yeah, an année sabbatique," and I'll say entre le lycée, l'université, and they finish my sentence for me. They nod their head and they say, "Oh yeah, yeah." Every student has the right to go to university in France, but to get into some of the really good schools, you have to pass competitions. So I think that the gap year is here. The concept here is probably not as much what you're doing as it is the year when you're like buckling down and studying some more in order to get into the university of your choice.
So I found it pretty interesting to learn that people in France will take a whole dedicated year to prepare for university, because in Canada, that's kind of something that people do during grade 12 alongside school. A lot of my friends are doing that. So this kind of also has me curious about whether taking a gap year just to prepare for university, whether even that could be valuable in certain ways, or maybe in similar ways to a year of travel, or maybe it's just not even the same thing at all. Now, moving on to question number 2, what is the purpose of higher education? I think that Kathleen had a pretty interesting perspective about the value of a liberal arts education, and this was kind of funny because this is kind of going against the last interview I did with John and Carissa, but I really enjoyed hearing her perspective.
I really strongly believe in a liberal arts education. But I think by the time you get into university, you're becoming more mature. Your intellect is kind of sharpening in various ways. You're connecting. You're making connections more, and so I think those humanities kinds of studies, those liberal arts studies that you do in university, have way more potential to broaden you as a person. It's like a base, a foundation that I could make connections. I could read an article in the New York Times and it would refer to something, and I'm educated enough to know, like I only have 4 years. I don't have any graduate degree in anything, but I have connections to a lot of things that I wouldn't necessarily have had. I like the idea of university as creating a well-rounded person in the world who has the capacity to respond to all kinds of news and current events and experiences.
Another interesting thing to point out is that Kathleen's perspective actually kind of goes against the typical perspective in French culture.
Like I said about the French, that they're kind of driven. Like for the French, the purpose of education is to power through to a career, you know? Yeah. So yeah, I have a different perspective on that.
So personally, I would definitely agree with Kathleen that it's important to be a well-rounded person in the world, but once again, I'm kind of curious about whether there's other ways to achieve this rather than university. Because for Kathleen, doing a liberal arts education worked out for her because her later careers didn't really require a degree. But for others, I wonder if, is it really worth it to spend all that money to become a well-rounded person? Going along with this, I think John made a great point that a liberal arts education doesn't necessarily just need to be in your university years.
I think higher education continues your entire life if you do it right. That's like I said, I'm still working on my liberal arts education.
I think another important thing to remember that Kathleen brought up is that for someone to, although it may be possible for someone to get a liberal arts education outside of university, doing it this way, it does take a lot more discipline.
A little rare, the person who is able to keep pursuing sort of, educating themselves in the way you would get that education at university, but doing it completely on their own. Yeah, it's a little bit rare. It takes a lot of discipline, so it's a rare person who just has that kind of self-motivation and can organize themselves and is passionate enough to do that.
So in France, it turns out that education is actually free for its citizens, but this has kind of created a problem where not everyone is necessarily taking their education so seriously.
Every student has the right to go to university, and it's become a bit of a problem because there's too many students, and they're occupying spaces in classes, even though they might end up dropping out after 1 year. And
since education is so expensive in Canada, I think it's something that people will often complain about, me included. So I found it quite fascinating actually to learn about some of the potential problems of free education. That being said, I can't say I feel too sorry for French students because I think most people here in Canada would take a free education any day. Now moving on to question number 3, what can travel teach about careers? For a large portion of their lives, both John and Kathleen were actually tour guides, and they ran tours in both Seattle in the US and Paris in France. Since Kathleen kind of took the management role, she doesn't have the best memories of this job. However, for John, he actually found the work to be quite rewarding.
I got the front end of the dog, which is meeting people from all over the world, and for 3 hours, giving a 3-hour cross between a 3-hour lecture and a 3-hour performance.
One thing that kind of worried me about John's job is how repetitive it might be, but I think his attitude towards this fact was pretty cool.
It was exactly competitive because I did repetitive, yeah. Because I did some. Well, I've lost track now. 5,000, 6,000 tours. I lost tours.
7,000 tours.
So there's only so many ways you could say. Yeah. About the same thing. It wasn't the 5,000th time I had said that. Period. It was the first time I said it to that particular person or group of people.
Yeah, that's a good perspective.
Yeah. I had, you had to be excited. You had to want to teach the subject, and I did. So.
Hearing this perspective from John, I think, kind of confirmed for me that attitude is really important with whatever job you might have. When it comes to French culture, people in France do take their jobs pretty seriously, regardless of how much it might pay.
So a person who is a waiter in a restaurant, that's their career. They're respected for it. They are compensated for it. That's their career, and it's a valid career.
And want to be respected for it.
And want to be respected for it, and people do respect them for it.
Now on to question number 4, is the Canadian lifestyle an illusion? This question I would like to once again start by talking about my personal experience a little bit. So both in the Netherlands and France, although I will say this was slightly more of a thing in the Netherlands, one difference that I've noticed in the culture, and I suppose you could say the quality of life, is that people are much less polite. I get that this is a Canadian stereotype, but coming to these European countries has actually really confirmed for me that the Canadian people are quite polite and very nice. This isn't to say that people in these countries are mean per se, but they usually won't go out of their way to show kindness in the same way that I've seen with Canadians. And I find this to be apparent just in little things like customer service, traffic, and public interactions. So for some people this might not be a very significant thing. However, for me, even though it is a small thing, I do find myself really missing this aspect of Canadian culture, if I'm honest. I think this has also made me realize that sometimes little things can really go a long way. Now, just really quickly, you may have noticed that I slightly changed the wording of this question. The reason for that is because I think this whole politeness thing, that's not necessarily as much of a Western thing as it is a Canadian thing. So I decided I wanted to be a little more specific with this question, so that's why I changed it. Going back to the interview, one thing that John and Kathleen have found that they prefer about France over the US, where they used to live, is that it seems like in France people really make time for each other.
I think for us, I think we can speak for you too, the difference in quality of life that we experience is the taking time to be with people. So, in the big cities, things have changed and people are going all the time. But as you've experienced here, when it's noon, the stores close and people take 2 hours for lunch. Like, they stop.
Yeah,
they take that pause.
I think this idea of people not making time for each other is probably a little worse in America than Canada, I want to say. But it definitely still is a thing in Canada, and this is definitely something I want to keep in mind. Now on to the final question. What is the meaning of life? With this question, both John and Kathleen had a pretty similar perspective that I've heard before about how the meaning of life is dynamic.
I don't think that there is a meaning of life. I think that each person discovers what the meaning of life is for them, and that if you could separate, if they're two separate things, the meaning of life and the purpose of life, then I think each person's purpose in life is to discover their own meaning and make that meaning for themselves.
So John and Kathleen are both Catholic Christians, and I think they both had a pretty interesting viewpoint on the role that religion plays when determining the meaning of life.
I don't think it's the way that I find meaning. I think it's like a vehicle that helps me in my process of refining my purpose and and making meaning. I don't think I would want a religious framework to be the meaning of life, because I think there's a danger there.
For me, Christianity, I suppose Christianity through the lens of the experience, history, tradition, beliefs of the Catholic Church help form a lens through that I see through. But I like what Thich Nhat Hanh says. Don't think that what you currently believe is absolute truth. There's not only one truth. This is why people kill each other.
So I really appreciated hearing this perspective about religion from John and Kathleen, since it's not one that I often get the chance to hear. I don't think I know quite enough about Christianity or religion to say whether I agree with this perspective yet or not, but it's definitely going to be something that I'll continue to think about and reflect on. Alright, so thank you for watching my third video update. As I said at the beginning of the video, these past 2 weeks definitely have been my most challenging yet, but this has just meant that there's been plenty more ways to grow and things to learn. Also, I'm sorry that this video came out a bit late. Like I said, it got a little busy here in the UK. So normally in this part of the video I talk about how excited I am to go to my next country. But like I said, I've actually basically spent my entire time in the UK already. I'm actually flying home tomorrow. So I won't spoil anything, but my time in the UK has been a really great final part of my time in Europe here. And I'll look forward to telling you more about it in my next video. So thanks again for watching, and make sure to stay tuned for my 4th video update, which I'll be recording from my home in Canada. I must say I'm quite excited to go back. But yeah, that should be coming in the next week or so, and yeah, thanks for keeping up with my project.